The vastness of space was silent, yet the tension around Sunspire Academy was deafening. Nestled on the edge of human-controlled space, the Academy had always been a beacon of learning and discipline, a place where young cadets honed their skills for the greater future of humanity. But today, its halls buzzed with an unfamiliar energy fear. A transmission had arrived that morning, intercepted by deep space scanners. At first, it was nothing more than a garbled mess of signals, but as the decryption software unraveled its layers, the message became terrifyingly clear. An invasion was coming. The Acceleri Dominion, a coalition of warlike alien species that had long viewed humanity as an unpredictable threat, had chosen their first target. Not a military outpost, not a warship, but Sunspire itself. The reasoning was painfully obvious: strike at humanity's future before it could shape its warriors. The fleet was already on its way, and there was no hope for immediate reinforcements. The Terran Defense Fleet was engaged elsewhere, locked in conflicts across multiple systems, and the closest warships were at least 6 days away. Sunspire had only hours. Commander Elara Voss stood in the Academy's command center, her sharp gaze fixed on the incoming threat displayed across the holographic interface. The enemy fleet was massive, easily outmatching anything Sunspire could throw at them. This was no small-scale raid. This was an extermination. Her fingers curled into fists as she turned to her officers. "Status of the defense grid?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. Lieutenant Eric Hale, her second-in-command, grimaced as he scanned the data. "Partially operational, Commander. We have standard-grade orbital cannons, but they're designed for training exercises, not war. Shields are running at 80%, but against that many warships?" He hesitated, glancing at the numbers. "They'll collapse within an hour once the assault begins." Elora exhaled sharply, her mind racing through every possible scenario. This academy was filled with some of the brightest young minds humanity had to offer, but they were not soldiers yet. They had trained for battles that would come in the future, not today. Meanwhile, deep within the cadet barracks, Adrian Kane was already aware of the unfolding disaster. Unlike many of his fellow cadets, he didn't need to be told what was happening. The whispers, the hurried footsteps, the increased security, it all painted a clear picture. Something terrible was coming. When the Academy's emergency sirens howled through the corridors, his fears were confirmed. Rushing towards the main assembly hall, he found himself surrounded by fellow cadets, all of them wearing the same expression of unease. Soon, Sarah Lynn, one of the most skilled engineering cadets, appeared beside him, her usually calm face betraying a flicker of fear. "Have you seen the fleet report?" she asked breathlessly. Adrian shook his head, but he knew it was bad. Really bad. The moment Commander Voss's voice echoed through the Academy speakers, the room fell into absolute silence. "Cadets of Sunspire," she began, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "Today, we face the impossible. A hostile fleet approaches, and our defenses are limited. The enemy sees us as weak, as vulnerable. They expect us to surrender. They expect us to be afraid." She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. "But they have underestimated the spirit of humanity. We will not run. We will not cower. We will stand, and we will fight." The Academy's walls trembled, not from an attack, but from the roar of determination that erupted among the cadets. Fear was still there, but something far greater had taken its place: defiance. These were not ordinary students. They had trained under the best tacticians, studied the greatest battles in human history, and learned to adapt in the face of overwhelming odds. If they were to go down, they would make sure the enemy remembered their names. Adrian wasted no time. He pushed his way to the front, his mind already working through possible strategies. "We need a plan," he said, turning to Sarah. "If we can't stop the fleet, we need to stall them. Slow them down. Make them pay for every inch of ground." Sarah nodded, already considering what resources they had. "The old training drones, we can repurpose them. Modify their attack patterns, rewire them into kamikaze units." Adrian's eyes lit up at the idea. "And the shield generators?" he asked. Sarah hesitated. "They won't last long, But if we reconfigure the output, we might be able to concentrate the energy in bursts rather than a continuous field. It won't hold forever, but it could disrupt their assault. The idea of untested cadets defending an academy against a fleet was madness. But madness was often the foundation of human ingenuity. As Adrian and Sarah hurried to gather volunteers, the reality of the situation sank in. There was no escape. The enemy wasn't here to negotiate, and surrender was not an option. If Sunspire fell, so too would the legacy of every great warrior who had trained within its halls. Humanity's enemies wanted to snuff out the next generation before they could rise. But they had made a critical mistake. They had given these cadets a reason to fight. On the observation deck, Commander Voss watched the darkness of space, where the enemy fleet would soon emerge. A storm was coming. The first battle of Sunspire Academy was about to begin, and it would be one that the galaxy would never forget. The Academy was never meant to be a battlefield, but as the hours slipped away, Sunspire Academy transformed into something unrecognizable. The once orderly halls, designed for training simulations and classroom lectures, were now filled with cadets racing against time, fortifying whatever defenses they could. The roar of machinery echoed as engineering teams modified drones, repurposed mining equipment, and turned every available resource into something that could be used for war. Adrian Kane stood at the center of the chaos, issuing orders with a precision far beyond his years. His mind worked like a battlefield strategist, calculating every possible move the enemy could make. They were outnumbered and outgunned, but that didn't mean they were helpless. If they couldn't win through sheer strength, they would win through ingenuity. Sarah Lynn, covered in grease and sweat, worked tirelessly with the other engineering cadets, rerouting power from non-essential systems to the Academy's shields. Every percentage point mattered. The shield wouldn't hold forever, but if they could force the enemy to waste time breaking through, it might just buy them the edge they needed. Above them, the Academy's ancient defense grid flickered to life. The orbital cannons, meant only for training exercises, were programmed with a new targeting system, one that Adrian had personally adjusted. They couldn't destroy capital ships, but they could harass and disrupt formations. Every second of confusion was a second they could use to their advantage. The reality of what they were doing had started to set in among the cadets. These weren't simulations anymore. This wasn't a drill. When the enemy landed, there would be no second chances. Some of them were barely 18, trained to handle diplomacy and military strategy, not real combat. And yet, here they were, standing on the precipice of war. Fear was there, it always was, but something else burned in their eyes. Defiance. Determination. A refusal to let their future be decided by anyone but themselves. Commander Elora Voss watched them from the command center, her face unreadable. She had spent years molding these cadets, pushing them beyond their limits, preparing them for the harsh realities of war. But she had never imagined they would have to fight so soon, nor under such dire circumstances. She knew the odds. No experienced military commander would expect victory from an untrained force with minimal weapons and no reinforcements. But humanity had never followed the rules of war. It had never bowed to overwhelming odds. And that was why she still had hope. Lieutenant Eric Hale approached her, his face grim. "The fleet has entered our outer perimeter." "ET, 10 minutes. Voss nodded, her voice steady. "Then we hold." She turned her gaze back to the cadets, who had now gathered in formations across the academy. "They will remember this day, Lieutenant. They will remember that we did not kneel." As the first enemy warships entered the planet's atmosphere, the sky above Sunspire turned into a storm of fire and metal. The orbital defenses opened fire, sending streaks of energy toward the descending ships. Explosions bloomed in the sky, but the enemy pressed on. The Accelerate Dominion had come prepared. They deployed drop pods, massive metal capsules designed to crash into the surface and unleash elite shock troops. The moment they hit the ground, the real battle would begin. Adrian and Sarah had anticipated this. Before the enemy even touched down, they activated a series of modified drones that darted through the air, colliding with the incoming pods in suicidal attacks. Some pods exploded mid-air, torn apart before they could deploy their troops. Others still made it through, slamming into the academy's courtyard with enough force to shake the ground. The moment they cracked open, the alien warriors emerged, their weapons glowing in the dim light. But the cadets did not wait. They had set traps, planted makeshift explosives, and positioned themselves at choke points. The first wave of XLR troops found themselves under immediate fire, caught in a crossfire of repurposed training weapons and improvised explosives. The enemy had expected fear. They had expected chaos. Instead, they were met with strategy and discipline. Adrian led a strike team through the academy's underground tunnels, flanking enemy positions and hitting them from behind. Every corridor became a battlefield, every room a war zone. The cadets fought like veterans, not because they had years of experience, but because they had no other choice. Sarah, meanwhile, remained in the command center, directing power surges to different sections of the academy, sealing off hallways, and even rerouting ventilation systems to disorient the enemy. Every second mattered. Every small victory meant survival. And yet, the battle was far from over. More drop pods were landing. More enemies were flooding the academy. The cadets were holding, but for how long? A loud explosion rocked the eastern wing, where one of the makeshift barriers had finally collapsed. The enemy forces surged forward, overwhelming the cadets stationed there. Adrian saw it happen from across the courtyard, his heart pounding. They needed a counterattack now. Without hesitating, he led a group of cadets through the rubble, engaging in close combat with the XLR troops. The aliens were stronger, faster, and more heavily armed, but the cadets were unpredictable. They used every trick, every lesson, every desperate maneuver they had ever learned. It wasn't about overpowering the enemy. It was about outsmarting them. Commander Voss watched the battle unfold from above, her fingers tightening around the railing. They were holding, but barely. If reinforcements didn't arrive soon, this would turn into a massacre. But surrender was not an option. Humanity's future was here, on this battlefield. These cadets were more than just students. They were the next generation of warriors, and they would not fall without a fight. The sky above them burned as the battle raged on. The fate of Sunspire and perhaps all of humanity hung in the balance. The real war had only just begun. The battlefield was no longer just the academy grounds. It was everywhere. Smoke and fire painted the sky above Sunspire Academy, and the once pristine halls of learning had been reduced to a war zone. The air was thick with the stench of burning metal, the echoes of gunfire, and the roars of an enemy that had expected an easy victory. But instead of frightened cadets surrendering at the sight of an overwhelming force, the Exilari Dominion had met something they had never anticipated: resistance. Untrained but determined, outgunned but not outmatched, the cadets of Sunspire fought with the fury of a species that had spent its entire history defying the odds. Every corridor, every courtyard, every stairwell had become a place of battle, where young men and women who were meant to be strategists and diplomats instead became warriors. Adrian Kane wiped the sweat from his brow, his body aching from the hours of relentless fighting. His uniform was torn, streaked with dirt and blood, some of it his, some of it not. He had led counterattack after counterattack, using the Academy's underground tunnels to launch ambushes, disrupting enemy positions before vanishing back into the shadows. But the enemy was adapting. They were relentless, sending heavier forces, deploying combat droids that could tear through walls and cut down anyone who stood in their way. Sunspire was holding, but just barely. He turned to Sarah Lynn, whose face was pale but determined as she crouched over a damaged control panel, rewiring the Academy's power grid. "How much longer can we keep the shields up?" he asked, his voice raw. Sarah shook her head. "Minutes. Maybe less. I've rerouted everything I can, but we were never meant to withstand a full-scale assault." Her fingers worked quickly, trying to override one of the automated turret systems, desperate to turn the Academy's own defenses against the invaders. A deep, thunderous explosion shook the ground beneath them. Adrian's heart pounded as he realized what had happened. The eastern wing was gone. The enemy had blasted straight through it, sending debris and fire cascading into the air. That was one of their last strongholds. If they didn't push back now, it was over. He turned to the cadets around him, faces smeared with dirt, eyes filled with exhaustion and determination. "We make our stand here," he said, his voice unwavering. "They think we're just students. They think we'll break. Let's show them what humanity is made of." The cadets nodded, gripping their weapons tighter, their fear replaced by something far greater defiance. The enemy surged forward, their armored warriors moving in formation, their energy weapons cutting through the smoke-filled air. Adrian and his team didn't wait. They struck first. Explosions tore through the battlefield as makeshift charges, set by the Academy's engineering cadets, detonated beneath enemy feet. The moment of chaos was all they needed. With a roar, the cadets charged, their weapons blazing. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was pure, brutal survival. Commander Alara Voss watched from the command center, her face a mask of stone. The battle was slipping out of their control. The cadets had fought harder than anyone could have imagined, but the enemy kept coming. For every alien soldier they cut down, 2 more took its place. The enemy fleet still loomed above them, bombarding the Academy's outer defenses. If something didn't change now, Sunspire would be nothing more than ruins within the hour. "Lieutenant Hale," she said, turning to her second-in-command. "What's the status of the orbital cannons?" Hale grimaced. "We've lost 3. The last one is still functional, but it won't hold out much longer." Voss narrowed her eyes. "1 was enough. Redirect its target," she ordered. "Aim for their command ship." Hale's eyes widened. "But if we do that, we won't be able to take out their landing forces. They're already here," Voss cut in. "If we don't take out their leadership, it won't matter." Hale hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Understood." He relayed the command, and far above them, the last operational orbital cannon adjusted its trajectory. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Adrian was locked in combat with a HFY warlord, a towering brute with armor thick enough to withstand direct energy blasts. The alien swung a massive blade toward him, and Adrian barely managed to duck in time, feeling the heat of the weapon as it sliced through the air. He rolled to the side, raising his rifle and firing point blank. The shots struck the alien's armor, but barely slowed it down. The warlord roared, lunging forward, but before it could strike, a sudden boom echoed across the battlefield. The sky turned red. Above them, the enemy's command ship had been struck directly in its core. Fire erupted from within, consuming the massive war vessel in an instant. For a split second, everything seemed to stop. The HFY forces turned their eyes toward the burning remains of their flagship, their disciplined ranks suddenly wavering. Adrian didn't waste the opportunity. "Now!" he shouted. The cadets surged forward with renewed fury, pushing the enemy back, driving them away from the Academy walls. Without their command ship to coordinate them, the HFY assault became disorganized. They had lost their central leadership, and now they were vulnerable. The tide was turning, but the battle wasn't over. As the remaining enemy forces retreated, a chilling realization settled in Adrian's mind. This was just the beginning. The HFY had thought humanity would fall easily, that a simple academy would crumble without resistance. Instead, they'd been met with fire and fury, with young warriors who refused to bow. And now, the enemy knew that humanity was not just another species to conquer. They were a species to fear. Sunspire Academy still stood. The cadets had won. But war was coming. And next time, they would not be the ones on the defensive. They would be the storm. The air inside Sunspire Academy was thick with the scent of burning metal, scorched circuits, and the lingering tension of battle. The once pristine halls had become a war zone, littered with debris, shattered glass, and the remains of enemy drones. Outside, the sky was a storm of smoke and fire, as the last remnants of the HFY Dominion's assault ships hovered above, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. The cadets had fought harder than anyone could have imagined, holding back an army that should have wiped them out within hours. But now, their defenses were crumbling, their resources running dangerously low, and their enemy was preparing for a final push. Adrian Kane stood at the heart of the Academy's command center, his mind racing as he scanned the flickering holographic display in front of him. Every red marker represented an enemy force closing in, and there were too many. The orbital defenses had been decimated, and the Academy's last remaining turret had stopped firing 10 minutes ago. If they didn't act now, there wouldn't be anything left to defend. His muscles ached, his uniform was torn, and exhaustion clawed at the edges of his mind, but he couldn't afford to stop. They needed a plan, something bold, something risky, something the Excelari wouldn't expect. A desperate gamble. Sarah Lynn, her hands stained with grease and her face streaked with soot, worked frantically at the last operational console, trying to override the Academy's failing power grid. "We don't have much left," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "Shields are down, and most of our automated defenses are offline. Whatever we do, we have to do it fast." Adrian turned to her, his mind already forming a dangerous idea. "What if we don't defend?" he said. Sarah frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Excelari think they've already won," he explained. "They're waiting for our last stand. What if we don't give it to them? What if we make them chase us?" Commander Alara Voss, standing at the far end of the room, finally spoke. "You're suggesting a retreat?" Her voice was unreadable, but Adrian could see the sharp glint in her eyes. She wasn't rejecting the idea. She was analyzing it. He shook his head. "Not a retreat. A trap." The plan came together quickly. The cadets would abandon the Academy, sending out false distress signals and making it look like they were fleeing in different directions. Meanwhile, Adrian, Sierra, and a small strike team would remain behind, using the Academy's last remaining power reserves to overload the reactor. If they could lure the enemy forces into the Academy before it detonated, they could wipe out a significant portion of the invading fleet in one blow. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was their only chance. As the cadets scrambled to evacuate, the Excelari warlord leading the assault finally made his move. His forces surged forward, entering the Academy in full force, believing their victory was at hand. They never saw the trap closing around them. Adrian and his team, hiding in the Academy's sublevels, watched as the enemy flooded the halls, searching for survivors. He held his breath as a squad of Excelari soldiers passed mere feet from their hiding place, their heavy boots echoing through the corridors. One wrong move, one accidental noise, and they would all be dead. Sarah worked feverishly, her fingers flying over the console as she primed the reactor for detonation. "Almost there," she whispered. Sweat dripped down her forehead as the system fought back, its ancient safety protocols resisting the manual override. Come on, then success." A warning siren blared through the Academy, its automated voice cold and emotionless. "Warning, reactor overload in 60 seconds. The Excelari realized too late what was happening. Chaos erupted as their forces scrambled to escape, their previous confidence shattering in an instant. The once mighty invaders, who had expected a swift and easy conquest, were now the ones running for their lives. Adrian didn't wait to watch the destruction unfold. He grabbed Sarah's arm and shouted, "Move!" The team raced through the crumbling halls, dodging falling debris and leaping over bodies both human and alien. The countdown was reaching its final seconds. The moment they burst into the open air, the shockwave hit. The explosion was blinding. A massive fireball erupted from the heart of the Academy, tearing through the enemy ranks, consuming everything in its path. The shockwave sent Adrian and the others flying, slamming them into the ground as a deafening roar filled the sky. For a moment, there was nothing but fire, fury, and silence. Then, as the smoke began to clear, Adrian forced himself up, coughing and gasping for breath. Around him, the surviving cadets were stirring, dazed but alive. The enemy? Gone. Their fleet crippled. Their forces obliterated. Against all odds, they had won. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Adrian looked out over the battlefield, the wreckage of the Excelari fleet, the ruins of their beloved academy, and the faces of the cadets who had survived against impossible odds. This wasn't just a victory. This was a message. The Excelari had thought humanity would be easy to conquer. They were wrong. The war wasn't over. But today, they had made the enemy bleed. And tomorrow, they would make them fear. The battlefield was silent now, but the scars of war remained. Smoke curled into the sky from the shattered remains of Sunspire Academy, and the wreckage of alien warships lay scattered across the landscape like the broken bones of some fallen titan. The war with the Exilari Dominion had been brutal, and humanity had paid for its survival with blood and fire. Yet, against all odds, they had endured. The invaders had come with the belief that humans were weak, that they would submit like so many others had before them. But they had learned too late that humanity was not a species that knelt. Humanity fought, and when pushed to the brink, humanity won. Adrian Kane stood among the ruins, his uniform tattered, his body aching from wounds that hadn't yet healed. The academy, once a place of learning, had become a battlefield where cadets had transformed into warriors. Now, it was a graveyard of both enemies and friends. He turned to Sarah Lynn, who knelt beside a fallen comrade, closing their lifeless eyes. There was sorrow in her expression, but also something else: determination. They had lost much, but they were still here. They had survived when no one thought they would. And now, they had to decide what came next. Commander Elora Voss approached, her usual cold demeanor softened by exhaustion. "The Exilari fleet is retreating," she said, her voice edged with disbelief. "They've abandoned the sector." The words felt unreal. The Dominion had never retreated before. They had crushed countless civilizations beneath their rule, never stopping, never fearing. But here against humans they had broken. It was proof of something greater than just victory. It was proof that humanity had changed the game. But Adrian knew this wasn't the end. "They'll be back," he said, his voice steady. Stronger. Angrier. He looked out at the cadets who had fought beside him, at the remnants of the once great academy. "We can't just wait for them to strike again." Sarah nodded. "Then we take the fight to them." It was a bold thought. The Exilari were still an empire, their forces vast, their reach stretching across the stars. But they weren't invincible. Humanity had proven that. And if they had done it once, they could do it again. In the days that followed, the survivors worked tirelessly, salvaging what they could from the wreckage. Ships were repaired, weapons were forged, and messages were sent out into the void. Humanity would not wait for another invasion. They would rise. They would fight. And they would carve their legacy into the stars. When the Exilari returned, they would find a humanity that was no longer on the defensive. They would find a force that had transformed from survivors into something far deadlier: conquerors.